Today's daf we're going to be learning a Shevuot, daf lamed chet. This week's learning is sponsored by Robert and Paula Cohen in loving memory of Helen Cohen, Hannah by Yitzchak Nechemia, my grandmother. And today's daf is sponsored by Shifra Tyberg in memory of her father Tzvi Tyberg on his yurt site today. Okay, we're going to get started with the top of our daf. So, and I'll also just mention, hopefully we'll be going up today or tomorrow, the registration for the Siyum. Our Siyum will take place on the 22nd, on Sunday the 22nd. Should be really Thursday. We're going to push it off to Sunday. And it will be on Sunday. Hopefully that will allow more people to join the live Siyum. Okay, details will be sent out. Shvuot Pikadon Ketzad, Teli Pikadon Sheyesh L'Biyadcha. Okay, before we start this, let's just go back to the Mishnah. And for this purpose, I will share the study guide and we will look quickly at the Mishnah. Okay, so the Mishnah starts off. There were 5 people making a claim. And everybody said, give us the pikadon you have. And the person said, Shvuah she'ein lachem biyadi klum, eino chayav el echad. Okay? The first case is someone said, I don't have anything of any of yours, denying all of them in one claim. They're only liable one. Then the Mishnah jumps to a second case. Okay, the braita is going to perhaps be referring to a third case. We're not sure. But what we're going to do is we're going to bring a braita with a bunch of different opinions. Particularly, we're going to focus on 2 of them, okay? And we're going to see how this relates. So the Mishnah continues and says, Shvuah she'en lecha biyadi v'lo lecha v'lo lecha, adding, and specifically we're going to see why this vav is very important. If someone says, I don't have it, not to you and not to you and not to you and not to you. So Tanakama, which we're going to assume as we go on, is Rabbi Meir, says, because usually the Stam Mishnah and the Stam opinion in the Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, says, you're chayav al kol echav echad. Why are you chayav al kol echav echad? Because you said, I don't know you, and I don't know you, and I don't know you, each one being a separate claim. You're liable of sacrifice for each one of those lies you told. Again, obviously, we're talking about a person who denies a claim falsely. Okay, if you deny the claim and you're right, obviously, you're not liable. The korban is all if you lied for the oath of testimony, of pikadon, of deposit. Then we have Rabbi Eliezer who said, Ad shomar shvuah b'achrona, which we're going to see today might be understood a little differently than we thought, right? When you read this in the simple Mishnah, it sounds like what it means. You have to say, Shvuah she'en lechem biyadi, lo lecha v'lo lecha v'lo lecha, Shvuah also at the end. Okay, that's actually the way the Yerushalmi understands Rabbi Eliezer. But in this next braita, we see Rabbi Eliezer is going to come out a little bit differently. And Rabbi Shimon says, Ad shomar shvuah l'chol echav echad. You have to say, Shvuah she'en lecha biyadi, Shvuah she'en lecha biyadi, Shvuah she'en lecha biyadi. As long as you didn't do that, you're only liable one because you just said a general. Okay, without adding the word Shvuah for each one, it's all considered one thing. Now we're going to go to a braita. The braita is going to mention Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Shimon. I didn't bother putting them on the chart because it's not really relevant for the whole discussion. But I talked about Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Remember, notice Rabbi Yehuda doesn't appear in our Mishnah at all. And we think Rabbi Meir is Tanakama. So now we're going to read the braita. Tanu Rabbanan, top of our daf. Klal eino chayav el echad, prat chayav kol echad echad divrei Rabbi Meir. What does this mean? Well, if you group them all together, you're only liable one. That kind of sounds like our Mishnah. Shvuah she'en lechem biyadi klum, right? You grouped everyone together, you're only chayav one. Prat, I say it sounds that way because we're going to have a big machloket what Rabbi Meir actually holds. Prat chayav al kol echad ve'echad. Okay, divrei Rabbi Meir. If you delineate each one, which sounds like what it said in the Mishnah, Shvuah she'en lecha biyadi, v'lo lecha, right? And you, and you, and you, then you're liable for each and every one. Rabbi Yehuda omer, Shvuah lo lecha, v'lo lecha, chayav kol lecha ve'echad. Well, now we have a bit of a problem because Rabbi Yehuda says that what we thought Rabbi Meir was saying, right? Which is if you say not to you and not to you and not to you, you're liable for each one. So what's he saying different from Rabbi Meir? That's a big question. We'll get back to that in a minute. We're going to finish the braita. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, and here we're going to see that the way we understood Rabbi Eliezer perhaps wasn't right, or at least not the way this braita understands it. Like I said, the Yerushalmi understood it like we explained when I read the Mishnah, which is until you say Shvuah at the end, meaning you say Shvuah at the beginning and you say Shvuah at the end. But this opinion in the braita sounds like Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Lo lecha v'lo lecha v'lo lecha shvuah chayav kol echad echad. You just need it at the end. Ashi Omar shvuah b'achrona means the last word you use. If it's shvuah, then we think you mean everyone independently, but not that you have to say shvuah at the beginning and shvuah at the end. Okay, you just need to end it with Shvuah, and then it's like saying everything I said, Shvuah for each one. Okay, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Ad Shemar Shvuah l'chol echad ve'echad. Okay, that's word for word the way we saw Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah. We're going to move on. What we're now going to do is have Rabbi Yehuda. Don't confuse Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, and not to be confused with Rebbe, who's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. These are three different people. Let's go through who they are. Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah is always Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbi Eli. Rebbe is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Okay, he's a little bit later than Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Eli. He's the one who is given it's attributed to he edited the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda is an Emorah, second generation, who's always quoting. He's studied by Rabbi, studied by Shmuel. He's always quoting them. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amal Shmuel. Klalo shel davar. So he's going to disagree with Rabbi Yochanan about how to understand the machloket Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda in this braita. Klalo shel Rabbi Meir. Okay, he's going to say something very confusing. Klalo shel Rabbi Meir prato shel Rabbi Yehuda. Klalo shel Rabbi Yehuda prato shel Rabbi Meir. Okay, in simple words, this is saying what Rabbi Meir considers a klal, and you're only chayav one. Rabbi Yehuda considers a prat, and you're liable for each one. What Rabbi Meir considers a prat, and you're liable for each one. Rabbi Yehuda considers a klal and thinks you're only chayav one. So what could this be? Because they can't be. We thought they were talking about either saying Shvuah she'en lechem biyadi klum, that you just clumped everybody in a group when Rabbi Meir said a klal, and when he said prat, it's when he distinguishes lo lecha lo lecha lo lecha. But if he disagrees with Rabbi Meir entirely, then there has to be some other case. Now pay attention to what Rabbi Yehuda said. Shvuah lo lecha v'lo lecha, and not to you. So now we're going to assume that the distinction between the two depends on if you put a vav in between each one or you don't put a vav. Okay, let's read. So that's the first case where Rabbi Meir says it's a klal and Rabbi Yehuda thinks it's a prat. If you say Shvuah she'en lecha biyadi lo lecha v'lo lecha, like Rabbi Yehuda said, if I say not to you and not to you and not to you, we view those each as independent. That's a prat. To Rabbi Meir, that's a klal. Why? Because he says if I say I don't know you and you and you and you and you, I'm grouping you all together as one group because I'm saying and in between each of you. That's a klal, and then you're only going to be liable once. And that's what he disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda about. Furthermore, they disagree about the other case. So what case will Rabbi Meir say is grouped all together? Okay, obviously if you say ein lechem biyadi klum, but everyone's going to agree with that it's only chayav el echad. Nobody disagrees with that. So what's the case that Rabbi Meir is going to think each one is liable? Shevuah she'en lecha, ein biyadi lo lecha, lo lecha, lo lecha, lo lecha, without a vav. If I say not to you, not to you, not to you, that means I'm judging you. I'm talking to each of you independently, specifically because I didn't connect you with the vav. And Rabbi Yehuda says, what are you talking about? The vav is the one that adds to each one of you. If I don't do a vav, it's all one. Not to you, not to you, not to you, not to you, as if you're one group. So it's a total opposite interpretation. Does the vav connect everybody as if it's one claim or separate them? Okay, and does non-vav connect or separate? And that's the machloka between them according to Shmuel. Rabbi Yochanan, Amal, hakol modim b'vilo lecha shu prat. What are you talking about? Obviously, in the case of vilo lecha, everyone thinks, both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, now we're going to go back and see this in the Mishnah, because remember what our Mishnah said. If we're assuming Tanakama is Rabbi Meir, this is why the sheet is important. It's very easy to go back. It said, Shvuah she'en lecha biyadi, v'lo lecha, and not to you, and not to you. And Tanakama said, you're chayav on each one independently. If we assume Rabbi Meir is Tanakama, well, then he obviously agrees with Rabbi Yehuda, v'lo lecha, you're chayav kol lecha ve'echad. Okay, so what case do they disagree about? What case is left? What if there's no vav? Lo nechleku ela b'lo lecha. Now look at the braita. In the braita, Rabbi Meir just distinguished between klal and prat. He didn't tell us which was which. Rabbi Yehuda said, if you say Shvuah lo lecha v'lo lecha, you're chayav kol lecha ve'echad, which seems to imply, but if you said Shvuah lo lecha, lo lecha, lo lecha without the vav, then you're not going to be liable separate korbanot. It's all going to be grouped as one. Okay, so that's what we're going to say here. Lo nechleku ela b'lo lecha, she Rabbi Meir omer prat. He calls that a prat. According to this explanation, what does he call a klal? Just a case where I say, I don't have anything of any of yours as one statement. Then I'm going to be liable one. But as soon as I distinguish it, not to you, not to you, not to you, whether I put a vav, whether I don't put a vav, you're going to be liable for each one. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, no, the only case you're going to be liable is if you have a vav. Without a vav, it's not to you, not to you, not to you, not to you, that's all one big case. Okay, and you're only liable one. So that's what they each say. We're going to learn this more. So if you didn't get it all, don't worry, because now we're going to see where does each person get this from. Okay, so now just before we get there, so even though I said this, but now we're going to read it inside. Ezehu klalosh Rabbi Meir. So if Rabbi Meir thinks that both languages of not to you, not to you, not to you, and not to you, and not to you, and not to you, right? Whether I say the end or I don't say the end, is going to be separate korbanot. So what case does he think you're chayav only one? That's obviously Shevuot she'en lechem biyadi, which everyone agrees with is a klal. Okay, so according to, just if you look at the charts, it's very helpful because according to Shmuel, they disagree about both cases, whether it has a vav or doesn't have a vav when each person is specified. They each say the opposite. One thinks the vav connects, one thinks the vav separates. One thinks without a vav it connects, one thinks without a vav it separates. Okay? Now, Rabbi Yochanan says they actually all agree about most cases. The only case they disagree is the one where there's no vav. And that's when Rabbi Yehuda thinks that's one case. They're all together as one. And Rabbi Meir views that as individual. So now the question is, B'mai kamifle? And what we're going to see is, we're going to say that Shmuel diyek mi braita, Rabbi Yochanan diyek mi matnitim, because we have two different sources, and because we're assuming now, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't appear in the Mishnah, but we assume Tanakam is Rabbi Meir. So we can infer from Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah, or we can infer from the braita. So each one kind of leads us a little bit to think of it in a different direction. And that's why Shmuel actually derived it from the braita, and the Rabbi Yochanan derived his approach from the Mishnah. How so? Don't worry, the Gemara is going to tell us how. So Shmuel diyek mi braita. So I'm gonna, it's written down here in the chart, but I'm gonna kind of go up where the braita appears. Mitika'ama Rabbi Yehuda v'lo lecha prate have. Michlal deshamei leRabbi Meir da'amar klale have. We have a machloket in the braita between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Right? Rabbi Meir wasn't good at telling us exactly what he meant because he just said klal prat. We don't know what the klal of prat is. However, Rabbi Yehuda comes as a response to Rabbi Meir and says, no, in the case of Shmuel lo lecha v'lo lecha, if you have a vav, you're chayav on everything, which makes it right on each one separately, which makes it sound like Rabbi Meir thinks you're not. So basically, that's what we're going to say, what Rabbi Yehuda views as a prat, chayav kol echad ve'echad. Rabbi Meir is going to call that a klal and say you're only chayav one. Okay, so therefore, and now Rabbi Meir is obviously going to have a case where you're chayav kol echad ve'echad because he says so in the Mishnah, and the only case that's going to be left is to say without a vav. Okay, that's how we get it. So let's read it again. Michlal deshamei Rabbi Meir damar klale have, because it sounds like Rabbi Meir must be saying that's a klal. V'amar le Rabbi Yehuda prate have, right? And since Rabbi Yehuda said v'lo lecha is a prat, we assume Rabbi Meir disagrees and says it's a klal, and then Rabbi Yehuda comes and says no, it's a prat. Okay, and therefore we assume, right? It's kind of obvious. If Rabbi Yehuda is disagreeing, okay, well then obviously Rabbi Meir must be saying the opposite. Rabbi Yochanan, what's his response to that? He's going to say, before we get to where does Rabbi Yochanan for his reasoning from, first we're going to say, how does Rabbi Yochanan relate to that proof? It's pretty good proof. Rabbi Yochanan amar, travayu le Rabbi Meir prata habe, va'amar le Rabbi Yehuda, v'lo lecha modin alacha, v'lo lecha pagin alach. Why are you assuming, he says to Shmuel, that Rabbi Yehuda says, Shmuel lo lecha v'lo lecha chayav kol lecha v'chad, is coming to disagree with Rabbi Meir? Why don't you just say that Rabbi Yehuda is saying, like, let's start with Rabbi Meir. Prat is, okay, what does Rabbi Yochanan think? Prat, according to Rabbi Meir, is both. Lo lecha v'lo lecha, and lo lecha lo lecha. Whether you have the vav, you don't have the vav, either which way we're going to view that as reliable for each one. So when he says prat chayav kol lecha v'chad, he's talking about both those cases. Comes Rabbi Yehuda and he points out one case. What's he trying to say? Oh, in this case, I agree with you. That's what he's saying. Not I disagree with you. I agree with you in that case. It's just, I don't agree with you about your second case. Now, it's not mentioned there that he doesn't, but it's obvious because Rabbi Meir says these two, you're chayav on each one. And Rabbi Yehuda says only in one and not the other. You know, you have to add and not the other. So what does Shmuel say to that? Shmuel says, that's not the way we usually have braita. When people disagree, right? Usually, Shmuel says, in other words, why would Rabbi Yehuda specifically bring up the case where he agrees with him? Usually when you have this person says this and that person says that, the second person comes to disagree, not to agree. That's if Rabbi Yehuda agreed with him completely, it would be one thing. But Rabbi Yehuda is saying, I agree with you about this case. but I disagree with you about some other case which hasn't even mentioned. It just doesn't make sense to write the braita in that way. Rabbi Yehuda usually, when he's coming to react to Rabbi Meir, he'll be reacting by saying, "I just bringing the case he disagrees with him about, not the case he agrees with him." So that's Shmuel's support for his approach. Okay, again, you have to remember what's really confusing in the braita, that it's not parallel. That's why they're struggling here. Rabbi Meir just uses these words klal and prat, and Rabbi Yehuda starts bringing a particular case. So that's why it's very confusing. Now let's go to Rabbi Yochanan, and what's Rabbi Yochanan's proof? Rabbi Yochanan diyegmi matniti. He says, let's go back to the Mishnah. Again, assuming Tanakama's Rabbi Meir, what does it say in the Mishnah? Shvuah she'en lecha biyadi, velo lecha, which according to Shmuel, once you put the vavs according to Rabbi Meir, that makes them all one, and you're only liable one. But what does it say in the Mishnah? Chayav kol lecha ve'echat, which leads Rabbi Yochanan to say, isn't it obvious that Rabbi Meir agrees with Rabbi Yehuda about the case of velo lecha, v'chayav kol lecha ve'echat? He says explicitly, right? Look here on this, right, on the Mishnah, and look here in the braita. What Rabbi Meir says in the Mishnah matches exactly what Rabbi Yehuda says in the braita. So they must agree about that case. Now, obviously, they disagree about something, so they must disagree in the case of without the vav. Okay, so again, let's read it inside. Rabbi Meir, shvuah ein lecha biyadi klal lahave. Now, the way they say it in the Gemara is like this. First, go back to the first line. Shvuah she'ein lachem biyadi klum. Okay, I kind of proved it from some other way, but the Gemara is actually going to use something else, which is the Mishnah says, if you say shvuah she'en lecha biyadi klum, you're only chayav one. And then it continues to say when you chayav on each one, and that's Rabbi Meir, basically. So michlal, from there you can infer, if the klal, the case where you only chayav one is ein lecha biyadi, where you just make this one very general statement. Michlal de velo lecha prate have. It sounds like the case of velo lecha would be a prat. Why? De isal kadata velo lecha klale have. Right? Which one is less obvious that you're only chayav one? The one where you say, and not you, and not you, and not you, right? That's obviously less intuitive. So if they're going to tell you, shvuah she'en lecha biyadi, nishme'in, and shvuah lo lecha v'lo lecha v'lo lecha, koshken shvuah she'en lecha biyadi. In other words, if you wanted to say, there's two cases where you only chayav one, if you bring the case of lo lecha v'lo lecha v'lo lecha, you're only chayav one. Of course, if you say, I don't have any of your stuff, anyone's stuff, of course you're going to be chayav only one. So why don't you bring the bigger, unique case first, and then you would have just inferred the other one. So that's his proof. Why didn't he take the proof I said? Because theoretically, you could say maybe the vav shouldn't be there, and it's a mistake. So therefore, right, but also my proof is also a good proof, right? Because it says explicitly, vilo l'chayu chayav kol echad. Theoretically, you could just remove the vav and say, oh yeah, that vav wasn't there. But this you can't remove. It says shvuah she'en lecha biyadi klum, you're only chayav one. And then obviously, if you wanted to say also lo lecha v'lo lecha v'lo lecha, you're only chayav one, that should have been the case you should have brought. Now, what's Shmuel's reaction to this? Shmuel amar, kol omer v'lo lecha, komer shvuah she'en lecha biyadi dami. He thinks it's so obvious that when you say and not you, and not you, and not you, it's the exact same thing as saying, I don't have any of yours. And therefore, he thinks that whole inference of, well, that one is less intuitive than that one, he doesn't agree with that whole theory. He thinks they're equal. So therefore, he doesn't go by this inference at all. Now we're going to start asking him, though, from the language of the Mishnah about this vav. Okay, and we're going to have 4 questions on Shmuel, and then we're going to resolve all the difficulties. So Tanan, look at the Mishnah. It says lo lecha v'lo lecha v'lo lecha, and it says chayav kol lecha ve'echad. And again, assuming that's Rabbi Meir, that clearly goes against your Shmuel, because you said that Rabbi Meir holds as soon as you have the vav, it clumps them all as one group, and you're not only chayav one. But here it says you're chayav on each one, so that doesn't make any sense. To which he answers, Tnei lo lecha. And as I told you before, we could just change the girsa. Okay? Just get rid of the vav there. Okay? This vav, it's a mistake. Okay? But you could see, like, whether you say vav or not vav, it's obviously super critical in the sugya. So you wonder why they made a mistake in that, but okay, maybe they made a mistake. And now we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to stop sharing your screen, but you could look at the bottom. I put all the questions at the bottom of the page. Anyway, then Tashma, but now we're going to go through a bunch of lines in the Mishnah where they use vavs also. And then it says, and if the person says, I swear I don't have your pikadon, I don't have your tzumet yad, your loan, I don't have your gezel, and avidah, and it says vav in between each one, you're chayav on each one. So again, they say, okay, just get rid of all the vavs. Tnei tzumet yad gazel avedan. As soon as you don't have all the vavs, well, you resolve the problem. Third question on Shmuel. You're going to get the hang of this. Tein lechitinu solim b'kusmin. And then it says, if the person says, I swear I don't have chitim solim b'kusmin, you're chayav on each one. So again, tnei solim kusmin, get rid of the vav. And that, again, that would all be Rabbi Meir's opinion according to Shmuel. That resolves it. After doing this 3 times, the Gemara says, wait a minute. Hi Tana kol hachi shabish Tana v'azil. Okay, if you weren't thinking this already, here the Gemara asks it. Is the braita so messed up? The person who brought the braita made a mistake in each section of the Mishnah? It really doesn't make sense to keep saying every time it says a vav, read it as if it doesn't have a vav, when this is a critical element. Whether it has a vav or whether it doesn't have a vav is what the whole sugya is according to Shmuel. So Ella, okay, the better way to say this is now, all along, and I kept pointing this out so that when we get to here, you realize that we kept saying Tanakama was Rabbi Meir. Now they're going to say, who's to say that Tanakama is Rabbi Meir? And then we resolve it because then the Mishnah isn't mentioning Rabbi Meir's opinion at all. Elahamane Rebbe. And this is why I went before who Rebbe is. Rebbe is a different opinion. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Amal. Now this is Rebbe's opinion in a totally different sugya. Okay, it has to do with machshava when you have a korban. I'm not going to get into this right now, but he says there, the Amar loshna kazayit, loshna kazayit vikazayit. Whether you say kazayit with a vav, without a vav, it doesn't make a difference. You're still going to be liable each one separately. Okay, totally different sugya, but either which way, pratahave. And then we just say that the Mishnah had the vav, okay, but it's Rabbi Meir, it's Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's position. It's not Rabbi Meir at all. It's the person who says whether it has a vav, whether it doesn't have a vav. Because if you look at the Mishnah distinguishes between either I say everybody clump together, then it's one. If I say you and you and you and you, or presumably right now we're going to say or you, it's all one and the same, and you're chayav on each one. Okay, and the only case you're chayav echad is ein lechem biadi klum, and then that doesn't matter to us about Shmuel's opinion of Rabbi Meir because it's not Rabbi Meir's opinion at all. And what we do is we find an opinion of Rebbe in some other sugya where he talks about the vav and not the vav and doesn't distinguish. And then we say, oh, that fits perfectly with our Mishnah. And then the Mishnah doesn't even talk about Rabbi Meir. And that's Shmuel. And that's why Shmuel diek mi braita, because the Mishnah wasn't even talking about Rabbi Meir. Okay, so now they say, but wait, last and final question. Tashma midide. But look in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah, Rabbi Meir is mentioned explicitly in our Mishnah in case you didn't remember. Rabbi Meir omer, afilu chita useora v'kusemet chayav kol echad ve'echad. Now here it says chita v'seora v'kusemet. You're chayav on each one. So you see, Rabbi Meir says vavs. It's individual, separated. So that doesn't work. So they say tnei chita seora kusemet. Okay, just read it as without the vav. Now here we're just changing one part in the Mishnah, so theoretically that's okay. My afilu, but then they say, but this doesn't make sense. Why would it be even if you say? Because if the whole point is Rabbi Meir saying whether, right, remember, according to Shmuel, whether you have a vav, whether you don't have a vav, it's all considered, right? I'm sorry, it's the opposite. According to Shmuel, specifically without a vav, it's going to be considered separate. With a vav, it's not. So it doesn't make sense that Rabbi Meir say even would be both, not only this case. So something doesn't work there. But then they say, and maybe you remember when we read the Mishnah, this is how he explained it. This case isn't like all the other cases. What he's saying is, even is not referring to whether I had a vav or didn't have a vav. That's not what we're talking about. It's only if I don't have a vav, you're going to be chayav on each one. That's true. But what he's saying here is, even if I just said chita in the singular form or se'ora in the singular form, okay, that word, now, what's the problem? If I say chita, I don't have 1 grain, right? If we assume chita means 1 grain of wheat, if I say I don't have 1 grain of wheat, my denial is not a denial that should get me a korban because you're only chayav a korban if I denied something that's a shavat pruta. 1 grain of wheat or barley or spelt is not a shavat pruta. So you might have thought I'm not liable. Comes Rav Meir and he says, even if I say it in the singular form, it's like the word fish, right? Fish can mean one fish, it could mean many fish. So likewise, if I say chita, I don't have wheat, right? Think about it, wheat also, right? I don't have chita. What I really meant was I don't have any chitim of yours. Okay. I don't have barley. I didn't mean one barley grain. I meant barley in general. Okay. And that's what it means. And therefore, that's the afilu. The afilu has nothing to do with our topic, and therefore we can move on. So we resolved all the difficulties of Shmuel, and in the end, you could explain Shmuel's explanation. So we have two different ways of understanding the machloket. In which case does Rabbi Meir obligate you for each independent one, and for which case doesn't he? Now we're going to move on to the next section. And then he says no. Okay, so now, let's say someone says, we're now going to the next part in the Mishnah. Let's say you say, give me barley and wheat. And then the person says, I don't have barley and wheat and all that. Rabbi Yochanan, pruta mikulam mitztarefet. We were just talking a minute ago about the shavet pruta element. If, let's say, I didn't have wheat, barley, let's say I had wheat, barley, and I denied my claim, but I had a little bit of each, and it wasn't a shavet pruta of each one. But here it's like three separate claims, right? Wheat, barley, spelt. But I had a little bit of each one, and all together they add up to a shavet pruta. Then I won't be liable three because I don't have three of each, right? If I had a shavet pruta of wheat and barley and right of each one, I'd be chayiv on each one. But if I had a shavet pruta of all of them together, then I'll be liable one korban for that shavet pruta. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says. But please about Rav Acha v'Ravina. Rav Acha and Ravina have a debate here. Chad amar a prate mechayev, a klali lo mechayev. The Chad amar a klali nami mechayev. Let's go back to this line. I say, I swear I don't have in my hands, right, your object, I don't have wheat, barley, spelt. Now, the question is, now, until now, we said, what do we think it meant? If I have wheat, barley, and spelt, I bring three korbanot. But now they're saying, wait, there's a machloket about, what about in the very beginning of my words? I said, I don't have, right? I don't have your item in my hands, not barley, not wheat, not spelt. Am I liable for saying I don't have anything of yours in my hands? Am I liable for that first part? That's the general. I kind of start off general. I say I don't have, and then I say what I don't have. Now there's two ways to read that thing. I don't have anything, not wheat, not barley, not spelt. Or is it saying I don't have wheat, barley, and spelt, which is only three things? Or do we view it as four? Are you chayav on the klal? So that's the machloket here. One of them, we don't know who says what, Rav Acha and Ravina. One of them said you're only chayav on the prat, the wheat, barley, spelt, not on the klal, not on saying I don't have anything of yours. And the other one said, no, you said I don't have anything of yours, and you also said I don't have wheat, barley, and spelt. That's four altogether. So now they're going to raise a difficulty on one of the opinions, okay? The one that says you're liable on the klal. Vahatani Rabbi Chia. We've seen this a bunch of times. Rabbi Chia comes, sort of gives numbers to the Mishnah and sort of talks about Mishnah. How, right, he has his own braita that's relating to the Mishnah. He brings an example where you're liable 15, and we're assuming, okay, and we'll see this later on, but we're assuming he's talking about a case where you said, I don't have barley, wheat, and spelt, and right, I don't have in my hands your barley, wheat, and spelt. And I said, and not to you, and not to you, and not to you, and not to you, to four other people. So altogether, I said it to five people. And then we're going to say you could bring five. Now, this is 15. Okay, in this case, 15. Now, this already proves 5 times 3 is 15, which means you're only chayav on the 3, on the barley, wheat, and spelt, not on the general. That's the proof. Okay, there's a bit of a problem. It says chataot, it should be Hasham. This is korban Hasham. Tosfot says apparently there's talking about a Shevuot ha'edut, not a Shevuot pikadon, but we're not going to get into that right now. V'im'ita is 3 mahavya. Now, if you're chayav also on the klal, it would be 20, not because you would have 4 on each one times 5. Hatane, no, you could say Hatane de prate kachashiv de klal kachashiv. You could just say that this braita was referring only to the korbanot you're chayav on the detailed things that you said, but not on the general. But you're also chayav on the general. It just wasn't relating to that. That's a bit of a weak answer. Hatane rebichia harekan isrim chata. But now we say, wait. But there's a different place where he says 20. So that must prove the opposite. There's a different version of the braita, or there's a different braita that says Rabbi Chia counted 20. Now, if you count 20, the only way you're going to get to 20, if you have 3 chitin sovin kusmin, is 3 times 5. You're going to need 4 times 5. So that must prove the other side. They say no. That could be talking about the case where the person denied 4 claims times 5 people. And then again, it doesn't prove anything about the general. So we weren't able to prove either which way. But now we're going to have Rava ask Rav Nachman a question. Ba'amine Rava and Rav Nachman really related to this. Hayu chamisha tobimoto va'amru lo. Ten lanu pikadon su'iyah v'gezav avidah sheyesh lanu biyadcha. So we said these 4 claims. Amar le'echad mehem shvua she'en lecha biyadi. He goes to one of them and he says, I don't have pikadon su'iyah gezav avidah. And then he says to the other 4, v'lo lecha, v'lo lecha, v'lo lecha, v'lo lecha. Mau. So what's the story? When he says v'lo lecha, achad mechayev is the only chayev 1 for each of the other 4 because he just said and not to you and didn't specify all those 4. O dilma turning out amubet, or perhaps a kol chad uchad mechayev. Maybe he's liable for each one, right? The first person he said each 4 and delineated it. Do we multiply that by 5 by the 5 people he said it to? So Tashma, now we're going to bring a Rabbi Chia as a proof. Yes, you would be liable 20 because when Rabbi Chia says what's the case? Now, we didn't really say, we kind of assume what Rabbi Chia was talking about. He was talking about a case like this, but now they're suggesting if you say that Rabbi Chia was Ida Parish, if maybe you're chayav 20 chataot in a case where, let's say, I said, I don't have 5 people come and say you have gezel pikadon, all those 4 things, okay? Pikadon sumit, gezel v'avida, and I say, and 5 people said that to me, and I say, I don't have for you, I swear I don't have for you a gezel, pikadon, a tzumeyad, a gezel aveda. And then I go the next and not to you a gezel and aveda, right? And you say all 4 of those things to each of those 5 people. If you're saying Rabbi Chia is talking about that you're chayav 20 korbanot in that case, right? Minyana'at, Rabbi Chia, minyana'at, what? Rabbi Chia is just trying to do simple math for us. And if I know I'm chayav when I say to you the 4 things and I specify them and delineate them, and then I delineate them to 4 other people, of course I'm going to be chayav 20. No one would think otherwise. So obviously, elalav de lo parish, it must be I didn't. And I just said exactly the question Rav asked Rav Nachman. I delineated to the first person, and then I just said, and to you, and to you, and to you, and to you. Obviously, he's talking about that. And look, he says you're chayav 20. So obviously, prata, shmamina, prata have. It seems like we do view these as detailed to everyone, and that I'd be liable 20 for each of those people. That was section 2. Now we're moving on to section 3. Anastu piti piti. Last section for this chapter. The last part, if you remember, of the Mishnah was all about if it's a case of knas and I deny a knas claim, I'm not liable to bring a korban because I could have just admitted it in court and exempted myself. So by me swearing falsely in court, I'm not actually basically denying a claim, a monetary claim that I would have to pay anyway because I could have gotten out of the monetary claim in some other way. But if you remember specifically about rape, there was a machlok of Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis in the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon said you're exempt because it's knas. And the rabbi said, what do you mean? There's a mammon payment of boshet and pgam. You have to pay the humiliation and the I forget exactly how to translate pgam, but the kind of, it's like a humiliation to the family. Okay, it's more than just the boshet to her for what happened, but also the humiliation for the family for the fact that their daughter was raped. And that's a monetary payment. And the rabbi says, you can't say you're exempt, that you can't just get out of. So now the question is, so what does Rabbi Shimon say to this? Okay, shaming is a good word. Thank you for the shame. Okay, so anastu piti piti. Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, my time Rabbi Shimon. So why does Rabbi Shimon say what he says? Ho'il v'ikar knasu tovea. Say because really, in the honest case, when a father claims my daughter was raped, what he's really claiming is the knas. Okay, the other thing is secondary. But Amar Rava, Mashal de Rabbi Shimon Lamad Devar Domeh. So Rava says, I'm going to explain what this is like. La'adam shamar l'chavero, tein l'chitim usorim b'kusmin sheyesh l'biyadcha. Okay, it's like I went to you. We know this case already. You have wheat, barley, spelt in your hands. That's mine. Amar lo, shvua she'en l'cha biyadi chitim. But now you deny specifically the wheat only. The eshtakach, the chitin who delaytle, hasolim b'kusmin eatle. Now, it turns out I was not lying about you were not lying about the wheat. You said you don't have my wheat, and it was true. You really didn't have my wheat. You didn't relate to the barley and the spelt. You never took an oath about them. So you're not liable because the part you took an oath about, you actually weren't lying. So now, what's the comparison? It's not really a good comparison. We're going to reject it in a minute. But let's try to understand the comparison. What Rav is saying is, it's like the person comes and says, you raped my daughter. And now when the person says, I didn't rape your daughter, the man says that, What he's really saying is he's saying, I'm denying that I owe you kanas. And since there's no liability for kanas, there's no korban for kanas, even though, right, he's just not relating to the boshet and pgam element. Okay, why is this a problem? Well, amalei abayim midami, this doesn't count. Because hata b'chitim kakafrele, b'sorim kosmei, lo kakafrele. When in the chitim tzolin case, when you denied the chitim, you only denied chitim. You didn't deny the part that you're actually, right, that I was claiming about the sorim and the kosmei that you didn't have. So, but that's not the same as here. When that man said, I did not rape your daughter, he was actually denying the whole thing. He was saying, I don't know her knas, and I don't know her boshet and pgam, because he's not saying right? He didn't say, well, I didn't say I didn't do boshet and pgam to her, because by saying I didn't rape her, that means I also didn't humiliate her and shame the family. So that's obviously not similar. To which Abaye says, I'm going to knock out your claim entirely, because if you want to start making comparisons, this is a more accurate comparison. And then actually it's going to lead to say that the person should be liable for doing what he did. And Rabbi Shimon said, you're exempt, and we were trying to explain Rabbi Shimon. So Abaye is going to reject this whole thing, and then we're going to have a different explanation of Rabbi Shimon, because this isn't really going to work. Remember, Rabbi Shimon's basically saying that the main part about the rape was the knas payment, and not really the other one that was secondary to it and not important. But it's not like it doesn't exist; it's still there. And then again, there's a denial of a monetary claim. So halo dam, your rabbi says, I'm going to compare it to this case and show you that you're wrong. Okay, again, I claim you have all those three things in mind. Then you say, you say, klal, I don't have any of these things. The eshtekach, and it turned out, and that you did deny the entire claim, because the guy denied the entire rape, which includes both knas and, right, and monetary payment. Now, it turns out, in that case of the chitim and solim, and here's going to be the comparison, chitin hu delele, it's going to be similar to Rava's case, but a little different. You actually denied everything, but it turns out you really didn't have wheat. That part you were right about, just like in this case. Not that he was right about the knas, but he's not liable a korban for the knas part. But hasolim kosmin itle. But he is denying the sorim and the kosmin, okay? And mechayev. He's obviously obligated on the part that he denied that was a lie, right? He denied three things. One, he was actually correct about. Two, he lied about. So we now that's going to be much more similar to the rape, because in the rape case, while it's true that he is denying something that he wouldn't be liable a korban for, he's also denying something that he would be liable a korban for, which is the boshet and pgam payment, because there's two elements of it. It's not exactly the same, because it's not like there were three claims, but theoretically what we're saying is the father who comes, and this is important to understand the next part, the father who comes to say you raped my daughter is claiming two things in court, or three really, right? One is the knas, the 50 shekel payment they have to pay, and the other is the boshet and pgam. So it's really three. It's knas, boshet, and pgam. So the boshet and pgam is still there, and the person denied that. So obviously there's a denial, and there's a korban, and that doesn't make any sense. So we're back to understanding what did Rabbi Shimon mean. Ela ki'ata Rabban Rabbi Yochanan, l'divrei Rabbi Shimon, knas hu tovea below boshet upgam. L'divrei chachamim, af boshet upgam hu tovea. Or maybe not even off. It could be just boshet upgam hu tovea. B'mai kami palgi. Now, what's the root of the machlok? What are we saying here? Now, this is based on this assumption that if I go to court to claim some monetary payment, some payment, I might be better off. In this case, basically, the father comes to court to say, the person raped my daughter, I'm chayav knas and boshet and pgam. Often someone might decide, I'm going to come to court, and instead of claiming you owe me a lot of money, I'm just going to start with the first one. I'm going to start with either my knas payment or my boshet and pgam payment. And which one would I start with? That's the machlokah between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis. So according to Rabbi Shimon, you're going to go for the knas. And that's why if the person denies it, they're just denying the knas. And that's why you're exempt. And the rabbi is saying, what are you talking about? The person's going to go for the boshet and pgam. Now, why one over the other? What's the real machloket? Amar Papa, Rabbi Shimon, Savar lo shavik inish midi de kit, v'tava midi de lo kit. What's the difference between the knas payment? The knas payment is a clear-cut payment. It's 50 shekels based on the Torah. The other payment is going to depend on what the court decides, how much boshet, how much pgam, right? That's a very subjective payment. We don't know how much it's going to cost. So if I'm going to go to court, I'd rather go and claim an amount that I know what I'm claiming in court. If I'm going to choose one over the other, I'm going to go with the one that I know exactly what I'm getting. Rabbanan Savre, Lo Shabbat Midi, Dechimode Be Lo Miftal, V'Tava Midi, Dechimode Be Miftar. Why would I go skip Boshet and Gam and go straight for the Knas when theoretically you could just come and admit in court that the rapist could come and say, oh, I raped her, be exempt from the Knas, and then I get nothing. So therefore, if I'm going to go for one, I'm going to go for the Boshet of Gam first. Okay, and therefore that's their machloket. And with that, Hadran al Shvuot Pikadon, we'll do a quick summary of this part before we start the new chapter. So this part of the daf that basically we started with, we have three sugyot. The first was this klal and prat of Rabbi Meir, this braita that was somewhat parallel to the Mishnah, somewhat not, brought in this opinion of Rabbi Meir, which perhaps is the same opinion in the Mishnah, perhaps is not Tanakama. We had two ways to understand it. And Rabbi Yehuda, who comes and disagrees, who didn't appear in our Mishnah at all. And we tried to figure out what's the machloket between them. We had two totally different explanations for Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, whether they disagree about two cases or they only disagree about one case. And then we had the Rabbi Yochanan who says a pruta mikulam mitzarefin, and then from there we got to also liable for the general statement, I don't have in your hands anything. We got to Rabbi Chia through that, trying to use that as a proof for each side, but we didn't really succeed in doing that. And then we explained Rav Nachman explained to Rava what, really that you're chayav on all these, right, that when you say to one, you specify, and the others, you just say lo lecha, we're going to multiply it, right? And that was based on Rabbi Chia also. And then we got to this machloket, Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis and the Mishnah, trying to understand what the root of the machloket is. That Hadran al Shvuot Pikadon, moving on to Shvuot HaDayanim. Shvuot HaDayanim, there's a bunch of cases that Dayanim can make you take an oath. Okay, there's mainly like Eid Echad and Moda B'Miktzat. Okay, there's another we're going to talk about right now, Moda B'Miktzat. Moda B'Miktzat is I claim you owe me 100 and you claim I only owe you 50. Now the assumption is I loaned you money. You say I already paid you back half. And the assumption here is that you might be lying. And therefore, we make you take an oath. Why do we think you're lying? If you deny the claim entirely, we don't think you're lying. Because we assume most people wouldn't be brazen enough to get up and say, it's called Ein Adami Izbanav B'fnei Baal Chovo. I gave you a loan, and you're going to now deny completely? You would have no audacity to do that. That would be really obnoxious, right? Here I helped you, and now you're denying the claim entirely. So if you say, I already paid you back everything, you're actually believed, based on human behavior and what we assume people will do and will not do. But if you come and say, I paid you back half already, you actually are not believed anymore because we're suspect that you actually plan to pay me the whole thing. You're just denying half of it right now because you don't have the money in hand and that you're really lying about. So therefore you don't want to lie. So you say, oh, I do owe you some because you're not brazen enough to just lie in my face completely. And you justify it because you say, well, I'll pay you the other half later. But therefore, we assume you're lying about the other half and that you really owe the whole thing. And therefore, we make you take an oath. If you're willing to take the oath that you really did pay back half, then you don't have to pay back the rest. Only if you take the oath. That's one of the Shvuot HaDayanim. And that's the one we're talking about now. So we need to know what are the criteria for this to happen. For you to admit half a claim and be liable, because not in every case you're going to be liable. Hatana shtek kesef. There's a minimum amount of value. Okay, it has to be 2 me'ah, which is a third of a dinar. That if I didn't claim that amount of money, you're not going to have to be liable, even if you denied half. It's just not important enough, less than that. And your denial has to be a very small percentage of that, which is a pruta, okay, which is, I think, I forget now, whether it's 136 or 164th, but it's forget, something like that. But anyway, it's a lot less, okay? It's a very small amount, but it has to be our usual shava pruta, okay? So usually we say modim mixed we give this case of 50 and 100. It doesn't have to be half. It could be much less. But it has to be the minimum amount of hoda'ah and the minimum amount of the tana. V'im ein hoda'ah mimina tana patur. Another criteria has to be that I said you owe me $100 and you say I only owe you $50. But you can't start talking about something else. Okay, we'll talk about, let's say I say you owe me chitim and you say, well, I paid you back solim, not chitim, and it's like something totally different. It has to be you admitted to what I claim you owe me. Ketza. So what are examples of this? Shtei kesef yesh li biyadcha, ein lecha biyadi ela pruta patur. Now, shtei kesef is silver, and then you claim a pruta, which is copper. That's not the same. Now, some people say we're talking about coins. Some people say within coins it's not a problem at all. This is maybe talking about silver, actual silver versus copper. It's a little hard to understand exactly what this is. Shtei kesef pruta yesh, especially in light of something we're going to see later on in the Mishnah. Shtei kesef pruta yesh li biyadcha, ein lecha biyadi ela pruta chayav. But if I say 2 silvers and a pruta, and you say, I only owe you a pruta, then that is because you even though they're two different things I'm claiming, but you denied something of what I said, part of what I said, and then that works. Okay, this is if I say, I gave you 100 shekel, and you say, I don't have anything of yours, you're exempt, because that's a complete denial, as I said before. That's your classic motive and mixed, as I said before. Another exemption. If I say my father lent you the money, now we think that this whole idea of you not being brazen to deny the whole thing is just not accurate. You might be brazen to deny the whole thing. And therefore, if you actually admit to half, we assume you're telling the truth because I don't have that relationship with you. It was my father. My father's not alive anymore. Now you're right. You're denying to my face. You don't care to deny to my face. So the fact that you actually said you owe me half, we assume that you're actually telling the truth because you're Meshiv Avidah, because you could have denied the entire claim and you would have been believed. So therefore, it's like you're returning a lost item and you don't take oaths on that. Okay, this is a different case entirely. I say you owe me money. You say yes. Tomorrow I go to you and I say, okay, give me back the money you admitted you owed me yesterday. And you say, oh, between then and now, I returned it already. Patur. Because again, we assume you wouldn't be brazen enough to deny things completely. So therefore, you must be telling the truth. But if you said, I don't know what you're talking about, we never had a loan, but yesterday you admitted to me, chayav. Okay, obviously then you're not believed. Okay, and when we made the arrangement, when I said, you owe me 100, and you said, yeah, I know I owe you 100, and then I said, listen, you're only supposed to return it to me with witnesses, and that was part of the deal. Tomorrow I go to you and say, give it back, and you say, but you have no witnesses, you're liable because our deal was that you had to return it with witnesses, and you didn't, so we don't believe you. Litra zahav yesh li biyadcha ve'en lecha biyadi ela litra kesef. Litra is a weight of zahav. I claim and you claim actually it's silver, exempt because that's not mimina ta'ana. It's not the same thing, silver and gold. Dinar zahav yesh li biyadcha ve'en lecha biyadi ela dinar kesef utrisi pudyon pruta chayav shakom min matbei achad. Here we talk about a dinar zahav, which is worth 25 dinari silver, because they're all like currencies that work together with each other. And this is why I said the currency thing before was a little tricky. These currencies are all considered part of the bigger one, right? Like everything's compared to each other. So that's all considered mimin hatana. Dinar. So next one, sorry. Kor tu'a yesh li biyadcha. Okay, I have a core of, that's a measurement of grains. And lecha biyadi ela letach kidney. Letach is half, but it's kidney, legumes, and not grains. Patur, because grains and legumes, right? The word grains does not include legumes. But core perot yesh li biyadcha. Perot we always see is like a general term for produce. Often it means grains, but it could mean legumes as well. And therefore you say, and lecha biyadi ela letach kidney chayav, because kidney is included in the word perot. Tanuchi tim vodala b'seolim. I claim wheat. You said, oh, I have barley, not wheat. Patur. Rabban, because it's not mimina tana. Rabban Gamliel mechayev, and many people understand that Rabban Gamliel is mechayev on all those cases of mimina tana. He thinks it doesn't matter if it's mimina tana. You claim partial of what I claimed. It doesn't matter if it's the same item, not the same item. You're liable. You said, we learned this a bunch of times actually. I said, you owe me jugs of oil. And you said, I just owe you jugs. Okay? Kankanim and kadim are really the same. Empty jugs. So look, I said jugs of oil. That includes jugs also. Because all you were really talking about was the oil. Rabban Gamliel, okay, and there Rabban Gamliel says, I think Adron is right here. Tano kelim v'karkaot, voda b'kelim v'kafar b'karkaot, v'kafar b'kelim patur. We're going to see that there is no motive b'miktzah when it comes to land. So if there's land and vessels, and you admit to the vessels, not the land, that's a whole ta'ana because the land is separate from the vessels. If you say land, well, there's no motive b'miktzah anyway if you admit to the land, so either which way you're going to be exempt. However, hoda b'miktzah karkaot, b'miktzah kelim chayav. Why? שהנכסים שאין להם אחריות זוקקים את הנכסים שיש להם אחריות לשווה עליהם. So if you agree, if you're hodeh b'miktzah karka, you're going to be exempt. Because again, karka, there is no motive b'miktzah when it comes to land. We'll see all this later why. But if you admit to half the kelim, this is what we call classic Gilgul Shvuah. Since you're obligated Shvuah in one, we can make you obligated Shvuah in the other. So since about the kelim, you're a motive b'miktzah, you have a Shvuah, then we can also make you take an oath also about the land. Okay, that's the nechasim she'en lem achrayut. That's metaltalin can actually cause you to do. Once you're already doing one, you can also take an oath about the other. Because their claim is not worth anything. They don't have da'at, so they can't claim anything. Although tikkun olam, they made you take a shvuah, actually. We'll get to that later. Ein mashbi'in et hakatan, and you don't make a katan take an oath, because again, their oath doesn't mean anything. By that, aval mishbein lekatan ulahekdesh. Okay, this is something we're not going to really understand yet. We just said you're not nishbein lekatan, and now they say you are nishbein lekatan. We're going to have to figure out what that means. And for hekdesh, we'll talk about that later also. Okay, quickly, we'll try to finish up. It's very late. Hechi mashbi'in alu, amar Rav Yehuda, amar Rav, mashbi'in oto b'shvuah mo'ah b'torah. D'chtiv b'shbi'acha b'Hashem Elohei Hashamayim. This is by Avram and his Eved, and he makes him take an oath. Amar le Ravina le Ravash, you came on Rabbi Chanina bar Idi, amar b'inan shema miyuchav. What you're learning from Avram, from the oath he made his slave take, that it was shema mifolash, because it says Hashem there. He says, no, afilu temer Rabbanan da amri b'kinoi, even a kinoi, v'nafkamina ditzarich la pusei chayvetz b'yadeh. You have to hold something in your hand. We'll see it's going to be a Sefer Torah. In that case, he says, hold my yerech. And they understand yerech to be his brit milah, circumcision. And that was a mitzvah. They didn't have a Sefer Torah in those days, so that's what they used. If you just say the name of God, it's a mistake, because you need to hold something in your hand. Amar Papa, even if you use tefillin, it's not enough. It has to be a Sefer Torah. You can hold like Rava Daha alone. It's Shem Hashem is not good. You need something in your hand, but it could be tefillin. As long as you had something in your hand, it's fine. Shvuah, you have to be standing up. Tamid Chacham, though, can sit out of respect. Shevuot b'Sefer Torah, Tamid Chacham l'chatchila b'tefillin. You don't have to make a Talmid Chacham hold a Sefer Torah. It's enough tefillin, but everyone else needs a Sefer Torah. With that, we finished for today. We already summarized the first part. The second part was just the Shevuot Dayanim, this mode of b'miktzah, what case it applies, what case it doesn't. And that's it for today. Sorry it was such a long daf, and we'll meet up tomorrow.